Hi, it's Dwyer. It's November 3rd, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Let's talk about a five-star situation in boxing that's developing, that's a bit underreported, that you need to watch. It's early right now. We'll see where it goes. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, it's just a reality of life that some of the absolute best athletes you've ever seen in your life continue to dare the odds until the odds ultimately work against them. So, Jerry Rice leaves the Niners, was outstanding as an Oakland Raider, then ultimately ends up on the Denver Broncos where he gets cut. Michael Jordan came back to basketball after playing minor league baseball. Loses in the playoffs to the Magic. You thought that Jordan's magic had run its course. Then Jordan, let me say this flatly, the best basketball player I have ever seen. Jordan goes on to win 3 more rings. But people forget that Jordan then came back again as a Washington Wizard. Right? Jordan was lucky that last year to have a positive plus minus. Johnny Unitas, literally, if you believe old timers, invents the 2-minute drill. Right? You don't even hear about the 2-minute drill these days. There was a time where football had what was called a 2-minute drill. Unitas, unlike many of today's quarterbacks, called his own plays. Right? Unitas, master at the end of games. But of course, there's the chapter of the Johnny Unitas legacy where he's a San Diego Charger. It did not work out that well. Ray Robinson leaves the sport on a high note. Right? He gains weight, challenges the then reigning light heavyweight champion. Right? A guy who, of course, ends up in the Hall of Fame. Joey Maxa. Right? Several big wins on his resume. And, of course, it's boxing folklore. All Ray Robinson has to do, because he's so far ahead on the scorecards, is to not get knocked down, to stay upright until the end of the fight. Right? The referee, Rudy Goldstein, has to leave the match because of heat exhaustion. So you have a replacement referee in the ring. And then, of course, heat exhaustion overtakes Ray Robinson. Right? That's how the middleweight champion loses his walkaway fight for the light heavyweight title against the guy who ends up in the Hall of Fame. Well, just understand, Sugar Ray Robinson came back to the sport. He lost to Gene Fullmer. He lost to Carmine Basilio. Right? Just understand, greats don't quite know when to walk away from the sport. Now, you have a great. Right? His name deserves to be with Rice, Jordan, Unitas, Robinson. Right? Certainly he's on the short list of greats. And that's Terrence Crawford. Right? Understand, Crawford just beat Canelo at 168. Right? After having never had a fight at 160 or 168. Think about the magnitude of that win. Right, Crawford, you're dealing with perfection. Even Ray Robinson, by the time he gets to Joey Maxim, had lost to Jake LaMotta. Crawford has no losses. Right, so you're thinking, wow, this is the perfect time. This is the perfect time for Crawford to walk away from the sport. Right? Undisputed in 3 different weight classes. His Hall of Fame candidacy is easy for voters. Right? They say Terrence Crawford, and people in the room are going to nod. He's going to get passed through. But understand, like Rice, like Jordan, like Unitas, people forget Joe Montana was a Kansas City Chief for a period. Like Montana, like Robinson, the fire still burns. So, you have a 5-star fight coming up that's a bit underreported, right? You have a 5-star fight coming up, middleweight unification match between Erislandy Lara and a guy that I believe belongs on the short list of the best fighters in the sport, pound for pound, right now. I've said so here online. Janibek, middleweight champion. Right? Now, just understand, that fight is huge. It's huge. That fight has a lot of questions. Right? Understand, Lara beat Danny Garcia. That's Danny's last loss, folks. Lara's 42. Right? The question is, wow, how much does he have left? This is the champion who doesn't fight that often, but who is dangerous. And he's fighting a Marvin Hagler figure. Janibek has been among the best in boxing for years. For years. But yet the public kind of overlooks him. We're focused on, great names, Canelo, right? Crawford, Usyk, Inoue, right? They have the attention in the room. Right? Not a lot of people are saying, hey, I think Janibek, unbeaten. I think Janibek not only belongs in the conversation, but dominates the conversation for me. That person's not getting any, play at the local pub. So now online, you have a situation. The press needs to catch up to this story. You have Crawford online quietly saying that he would be interested in fighting Janibek. Folks, it doesn't get bigger than this. Right? Understand, I know there are many people, let me raise my hand. I know there are many people who saw Crawford jump to fight Canelo and who thought, you know what, this is a tailor-made situation. In other words, did Crawford pick Canelo because Canelo's style was suited for Crawford? Right? Would Crawford pick Diego Pacheco? At 160, Carlos Adames, Janibek. Right? Did Crawford pick Canelo because Crawford understood that, figuratively speaking, after a great World Series, he was the pitcher who knew how to get this particular batter out? Right? Was this Crawford showing us he's the best at 168, or was this Crawford showing us he knew how to beat the undisputed champion at 168? Right? Crawford, of course, one fight at 154. Madrimov. right? You get the feeling that, Crawford picked Canelo in a blueprint centric thought process. Well, now Crawford's telling you he wants to fight a champion at 160. You get the feeling that Crawford, like Jerry Rice, like Joe Montana, like Michael Jordan, like Johnny Unitas, like Sugar Ray Robinson, is one of these greats for whom greatness is not enough. Right? You get the feeling that Crawford is still, after being undisputed in 3 different weight classes, that Crawford still has a burning fire. Right? They asked Jerry Rice why he's continuing to try to play. And Jerry simply said, the fire still burns. That was Jerry's response. Folks, Crawford, 3 undisputed weight classes in, still has a burning fire. So he's talking about wanting to fight Janibek. Folks, understand, Janibek Lara is a 5-star fight. In my eyes, that's the best fight in boxing right now. That's currently scheduled. Right? That's a 5-star fight. If Crawford faces the winner of that fight, right? If Lara comes in and undresses Janibek, and if Lara pulls the upset, Janibek's favorite in the fight. I know Crawford, who's quietly saying he's willing to fight Janibek, which is a stunner. I'm sure Crawford would gladly take on Lara, and that brings us to the next part of the story. I believe Lara's a Hall of Famer today. Lara is that rare champion who's actually older than Terence Crawford. Right, folks? Understand, this is a period of time for southpaws. Right? Think through the eras. Crawford, southpaw. Ambidextrous, but southpaw. Lara, Janibek, both southpaws. Understand who Lara is today. Right? Crawford, of course, is whatever he needs to be. Crawford's different every fight. Lara is a guy who used to be a mover, who has evolved into a slugger with a great straight left. Let's just say, with Crawford, you can't go wrong here. Crawford Janibek is a 5-star fight. Crawford Lara would be a 5-star fight. It would also bring the public into Lara's career. Right? A generation ago, I'm telling you, there was a sizable group that thought Lara got robbed. In not only the fight against Paul Williams, but in the fight against Canelo. Understand, Canelo did not give Lara a rematch. Right? He was about as enthusiastic in entertaining a Lara rematch as in an earlier generation Oscar De La Hoya was in entertaining a Pernell Whitaker rematch. Right? Understand, De La Hoya fought Shane Mosley a second time. Right? Let's just say De La Hoya was in no rush to fight Pernell Whitaker a second time. So pay attention to this Crawford story because, folks, he's taking us on a magical bus ride. Right? The big question you have to ask yourself is, where exactly is Crawford and is he right? Right? You got the feeling that Jerry Rice, who, again, when he got to Oakland, was great. Right? People forget that moment. You got the feeling that Jerry Rice, if the choice was up to him, would have kept playing. But grudgingly realized that he was no longer Jerry Rice at the end. Right? People forget, too, that Oakland got to a Super Bowl. Right? It's a covered up story. It's a covered up story. But let's just say I want you to go back and look at some Raider comments about how their head coach changed the game plan at the last minute. Also, the Raiders had a player who lost it. The Super Bowl is a different world unto itself. They had a key player who wasn't able to play. Let's just say that Raider Super Bowl story is as covered up as the St. Louis Rams versus the Patriots story, right? There are a few interviews out there with Marshall Faulk and Kurt Warner. They believe that, Spygate was covered up. They believe that some plays that they saved for specific moments, the Patriots knew what was coming, right? Just understand that sports has some secrets. We'll just put it that way, right? Understand, too, Ray Robinson loses to Carmine Basilio. Ray Robinson wins the rematch. Both of those fights could have gone either way. Both of those fights were split decisions. Right? Robinson, famous anchor punch, knocks out Gene Fullmer in one of the fights, but he no longer had the margin that he had before he left the sport. Right? Well, what I want is for people to ask the question. Crawford, 2 fights above 147. One at 154 against Madrimov. One at 168 against Canelo. Right, folks? This is for the boxing hardcore. Does Crawford know what he's getting into if he fights the winner of Lara versus Janibek? Right? Let me say, too, the Canelo fight. Right? Canelo has surgery after that fight on his left elbow. Right? Now, we can debate that fight. I'm not going to here. It was a masterful performance by Crawford, certainly by the end of the fight. It looked like Crawford was getting the better of it, right, in that 12th round, for example. Right? Certainly by the end of the fight, it looked like Crawford had cracked Canelo's code. I myself would pick Crawford in a rematch. Right? But understand, you have to ask a foundational question that is one that's inherent for greats in sport. Did Jerry Rice know what he was getting into when he joined the Broncos? Right? Did Jordan know what he was getting into when he joined the Wizards? Did Unitas know what he was getting into when he joined the Chargers? Ray Robinson ultimately gets stripped of the belts. He refused to fight a mandatory. Right? Does Crawford know what he's getting into at 160? And because of the timing, you get the opportunity to ask that question before a great fight. Lara against Janibek, which somehow has a co-feature, which is shocking to me, right? That's not a heavyweight fight, right? There's the heavyweight division, then there's everything else. There's a heavyweight champion, then there's everyone else, right? Understand, Janibek Lara is the level of fight that outside of the heavyweight division shouldn't have a co-feature, right? The Boxing Hardcore gets to see a great fight between two reigning middleweight champions with a question hanging in the air, right? Crawford. What would happen? Is Crawford actually going to continue his career? And is he going to do it against this level of fighter? Right? An argument can be made that Lara is in the closing acts of his career. When you're a middleweight and you're 42, let's say you're not on the front nine. But Janibek's in his prime, folks. Right? Janibek's in his prime being the dominant champion that he is. Right? Southpaw. Understand too, Canelo, let's think the math through. Canelo comes in, would throw a left hook. It's among boxing's best punches. Crawford had it blocked. Right? I would argue that Janibek's straight left, which he can also change to be a left hook. Right? Janibek, a southpaw, not a righty like Canelo. Right? Janibek, a southpaw, I would argue that his straight left is harder to block than Canelo's left hook. Right? So folks, pay close attention to the upcoming 5-star middleweight fight, Lara Janibek, and pay attention to the full story. Crawford online mentioning fighting Janibek. Right? And also just pay attention to the history. Some great athletes have not known when to say when. Right? The idea of Jerry Rice getting cut by anybody is stunning. But yet it happened. Right? The idea of Jordan being on a struggling team, unable to motivate teammates. Look at some of the interviews, people like Richard Hamilton and stuff like that, talking about their interaction with Jordan. It's clear Jordan fit in with early to mid 90s basketball, defined it quite frankly. But by the time Jordan comes back as a Wizard, right, he was no longer playing with his generation. Young guys had their own vibe. Right? Jordan, as competitive as he was, couldn't will that team to the upper echelon of the sport. And of course, his plus minus had dropped considerably. Right? Johnny Unitas, who would later sue the NFL, was clearly injured and not quite himself. Right? When, he was a Charger. My point to you is Crawford, no question. Dominant at 140, dominant at 147. Right, folks? He beat Canelo at 168. I would say boxing hardcore people have to ask the question, and it's a question the public's not asking. Could he hang against the very best at 160? There's someone who wants to find out. And that's Crawford himself. That's a 5-star storyline that all of us need to keep an eye on. Now, Crawford has people around him. Right? Bomac looks like he's on the Crawford plane. Wherever Crawford wants to take us, we'll go. Right? The question is whether other people around Crawford are going to say, hey, honey, that's enough. Or dad, that's enough. Right? Is there someone else who's going to step out of the woodwork and say, hey, player, you're already an all-time great, right? For the Blueprint crowd, I'll raise my hand here too. You know, the skull fight against Canelo showed that Canelo had foot speed challenges, right? Crawford's moving. He's more active than Skull. I don't mean to say Crawford fights a Skull fight, but let's say they're parts of the Skull fight. You know, in fact, if you want to see Canelo's foot speed problem, look at the Lara fight, the first one. Well, the only one, right? But just to understand, Canelo, as Crawford himself has said, there was a blueprint already out there on how to be effective against Canelo. Let's remember, Skull goes the distance against Canelo. Well, there's a blueprint out there. For both Lara, it's the Jarrett Hurd fight. Right? That would be interesting to see if Crawford, who again is different in every fight, decides to crowd Erislandy Lara. Right? There's the Jarrett Hurd fight against Lara. Right? Constant pressure in the pocket. In fact, we could call it Brian Castano. Right? That strategy bothers Crawford. And then you have Janibek's boogeyman, who's still active, right? Who's still world class. Denzel Bentley, who is boxing Janibek and doesn't get caught with Janibek's big straight left. Let's just say Crawford, who to me has to be a master of film study, because you see Crawford prepared early in fights, right? The Canelo left hook isn't a surprise to Crawford early in their fight, right? Crawford comes in prepared for it. Crawford, a great, has blueprints he can work with. And as he's shown, nobody follows a blueprint better than Terence Crawford. You don't even know if he's going to be righty or lefty. Right? Crawford has said in interviews that he wanted to come in against Canelo right-handed. It's the people around him who Crawford clearly considers, right? Who said, no, come in lefty. Right? Understand, Crawford mid-fight against Kell Brook. Look at the film. The fight's not that long. Changes from one foot to the other. Right? He comes in fighting one hand, then he mid-fight changes to the other hand. Right? Let's just say Crawford against both. Lara, right? Crowd him, come in, don't give him time to think. And Janibek, box him. Has strategies he can pursue. Folks, the situation at middleweight, historically one of the glamour divisions, has just become much more interesting because a great who has never fought at middleweight is interested in fighting one of the champs. Folks, that's a 5-star development. Let's all watch it. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.